following subject matter is real and only intended for mature audiences. Discretion is advised.
People are dead after deputies say a man went on a shooting rampage.
I knew a week before she died I was going to kill her.
I can tell you the scene out there is absolutely horrific.
Nobody knows where this individual may strike next.
This is 10-Minute Murder.
Welcome to 10-Minute Murder, brief and bingeable true crime. My name is Joe, I'm the host, and thanks for joining today. And an update on a previous episode that I did, and not an update on a specific story, but on me mentioning a line from Are You Afraid of the Dark? This won't go away for some reason. Someone called me chuggy for mentioning it, and I asked them what chuggy means, and they responded that me asking what chuggy meant was also chuggy. So that's a bummer. And if you're like I was and you have no idea what chuggy means, I looked it up for both of us. And it means that, in essence, that you're trying to participate in some trend that is old. It means you're old. It means we're old. We're all old now. Apparently, you can't talk about or mention anything that happened in the past because you become chuggy. And honestly, I think I'm okay with being chuggy. That's fine with me. My whole show is chuggy because I'm talking about things that happened in the past. So anyway, if you're new to listening to 10-Minute Murder, make sure you're subscribed. Wherever you're listening right now, just click the subscribe button. And yes, it doesn't always say subscribe because there are, I guess, like 100 different places you could listen to this show. And they all use their own terminology. Most of the time it's subscribe, but I think you'll figure it out. But when you do subscribe, you don't miss any episodes in the future. Also, connect with 10-Minute Murder on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Links for that are in the show notes, or just go to the search bar inside any of those apps and type 10-Minute Murder, and it'll pop right up. Now to today's story. At the turn of the decade in the 1980s, Hugh Hefner thought he had hit the jackpot and discovered the greatest thing that Playboy had ever had. 20-year-old model Dorothy Stratten. The young rising star's beauty had been drawing comparisons to Marilyn Monroe, and she had been just named the 1980 Playboy Playmate of the Year. But just when Dorothy had made her breakthrough, her story came to a sudden end when she was brutally murdered by the same person who had pushed her to pursue a career in Hollywood in the first place. Dorothy Ruth Hugh Stratten was born on February 28, 1960, in Vancouver, British Columbia, to Dutch immigrants Simon and Nellie. A year later, the Hugh Strattens had their second baby, John Arthur. Dorothy's sister Louise was born May 1968. Simon left his family when Dorothy was very young, leaving all the children to their mother. And growing up, many of Dorothy's relatives and friends described her as breathtakingly beautiful, but she never really saw it in herself. In 1977, 17-year-old Dorothy was attending Centennial High School in Coquitlam and working part-time at a local Dairy Queen to help her mother with the bills. One day she was on a shift. A 26-year-old club promoter and pimp named Paul Snyder walked in and immediately laid eyes on the beautiful young woman behind the counter. What Paul was looking at was his way to the riches. From a young age, Paul had learned to make his own way. He grew up in Vancouver's rough East End, known for its very visible poverty, drug use, and prostitution. Paul's parents divorced when he was just a boy, and after 7th grade, he decided to drop out of school and make his own money. Eventually, Paul grew a successful business as a promoter of automobiles and cycle shows at Pacific National Exhibition. But as regular jobs were not really Paul's thing and didn't make him enough money to support his expensive tastes, he eventually became a pimp. And I mean straight from the movies kind of a pimp. He wore a mink, he drove a black Corvette, and flaunted a bejeweled Star of David around his neck, earning him the nickname Jewish Pimp. Still, the Jewish pimp was never able to pull off the big score. He also couldn't really get into the drug business. As a local gang member from the Rounder crowd recalled, nobody trusted him that much, and he was scared to death of drugs. He finally lost a lot of money to loan sharks, and the Rounder crowd hung him up by his ankles from the 30th floor of a hotel. He had to leave town. And so Paul retreated to Los Angeles, where he acquired a gold limousine and worked his girls on the fringes of Beverly Hills. And during this time, Paul fell absolutely in love with Hollywood and even played with the idea of becoming a star himself, or perhaps even a director or a producer. But his attempts to get into the powerful circles mostly failed, and so did Paul's pimping stint, as in the end, the girls were not bringing him enough money. As a result, Paul made the decision to return to Vancouver. But this time, he planned to stay away from any illegitimate business. Not just because of the bad experiences in the past, but Paul was also tremendously terrified of going to jail. He once told a girl that if a situation ever came up, he would rather kill himself than be imprisoned. A statement that would later prove very true. I think I was supposed to say spoiler alert before that. When Paul then met Dorothy, he thought he had finally found the golden ticket back to Hollywood, and so he started grooming the insecure young woman. Paul complimented Dorothy on the things about which she felt most vulnerable, and showered her with expensive gifts and dinner. For Dorothy, who had never had enough money to buy nice things and had had only one boyfriend, all the attention and treats from the older man felt good. She was still just a shy teenager who didn't think much of herself and only dreamed of a career as a secretary. Paul's continuous compliments made her glow. Eventually, the two began seriously dating. It was then that Paul started to push Dorothy toward the career of being a model, and not just an ordinary model. Paul planned to send pictures of his girlfriend to Playboy. He had tried to promote other girls as playmates before, but without any success. But this time, it would be different. Paul called a German photographer named Hugh Hefner and arranged a nude shoot at his apartment. At first, Dorothy felt a little nervous, but she soon relaxed and fell into playful postures. After the first successful shoot, Paul took Dorothy to another photographer named Ken Honey, who had had a track record with Playboy. As soon as they received Dorothy's test shots, they immediately wanted to see more of her. And so, before she even knew it, Dorothy was sitting on a plane on her way to Los Angeles in August of 1978. There she was, chosen as a finalist for the 25th anniversary Great Playmate Hunt. Dorothy didn't win the contest, but she definitely now had the Playboy founder, Hugh Hefner's, attention. Just like Paul, Hugh looked at Dorothy with dollar signs in his eyes. And so, in the blink of an eye, Dorothy was signed on with Playboy, and in August 1979, she was Playmate of the Month. At this point, her surname was shortened to Stratten. Meanwhile, as soon as Paul learned of Dorothy's selection, he also flew to Los Angeles and proposed. Dorothy eventually said yes, despite the objections of her friends and Hugh Hefner himself. While others saw there was something not quite right with Paul, Dorothy still thought only good of him, saying, quote, "He cares for me so much. He's always there when I need him. I can never imagine myself being with any other man but Paul." The two got married in Las Vegas in the summer of 1979. For Paul, he felt like that now meant he owned Dorothy. He felt like he was the one who made her, and so he was entitled to everything Dorothy had. She was his rocket to the moon. However, while Dorothy initially felt an obligation to stay with Paul, she quickly began to grow more and more distant from her husband as her career continued to take off. In the end, while his wife was received with open arms, Paul didn't fit into the same category with her, no matter how much he wanted to. Soon, Dorothy was getting both TV and movie role offers. She appeared in Fantasy Island and Buck Rogers in the 25th Century. Then Dorothy made one of her biggest breaks when director Peter Bogdanovich cast her in his comedy They All Laughed, alongside Audrey Hepburn. However, Peter did not want Dorothy as just an actress in his movie. He wanted her to himself. During the filming of They All Laughed, Dorothy was living in his suite, and by the spring of 1980, the two were basically a couple and very much in love. Of course, Paul started to get suspicious at this point, and he realized his control of Dorothy and her career rapidly unraveled, and he became desperate. He didn't have a green card and was not able to make money by himself. As Mariel Hemingway, who later played Dorothy in the movie Star 80, said, quote, "As she started to slip away, he started to realize he owned nothing." Finally, when Dorothy returned from filming in New York, she told Paul the truth. She wanted a divorce. However, Dorothy wanted it to be amicable. She even mentioned a settlement for Paul because he had helped her get to Hollywood. Unfortunately, that offer was the last piece of the puzzle that sealed Dorothy's fate. On August 13th, 1980, at 11:45 a.m., Dorothy went over to the house that she once shared with Paul and tried to negotiate details of the settlement. Multiple people tried to warn her against going by herself. Some even tried to forbid it altogether, including both Peter and Hugh, but Dorothy didn't listen. She was a little naive like that, not wanting to see the evil in people. Paul had two roommates, Stephen Kushner and Patty Lorman. They weren't home that day until later in the evening. As both Dorothy and Paul's cars were in the driveway, when they got home, they assumed the two had reconciled and were still downstairs together in Paul's bedroom. However, after a few hours of complete silence, Stephen and Patty decided to check what was going on. They tried to knock, but there was no answer. Stephen opened the door. What they saw inside the bedroom was burned into their minds forever. As Patty said, quote, "It looked like it was from a horror movie, a staged horror movie, like mannequins and fake blood." Both Paul and Dorothy were dead on the floor in a pool of blood and brain matter. Police later determined that Paul had raped Dorothy before or after shooting her in the face with a 12-gauge shotgun. He then turned the gun on himself, as he said he would do. He was not going to prison. It was Paul's way of taking back control, regaining his position of power. He realized he didn't have a future with Dorothy anymore, and he didn't want anybody else to have it either. Paul showed both Hugh and Peter what they got for messing with him. At the same time, Paul let everybody know how egotistic and spineless he really was, an absolute monster. The murder-suicide sent shockwaves through Hollywood. While Peter and Hugh were both devastated over losing Dorothy, Peter blamed the culture of Playboy for contributing to his lover's death. He also later accused Hugh of making sexual advances on Dorothy at the Playboy Mansion in his book, The Killing of the Unicorn, which was published 4 years after the incident. However, Hugh denied ever touching her and said, quote, "Dorothy's tragic death was motivated not in any way by her association with Playboy, but clearly by the breakup of her marriage because of the affair with Peter Bogdanovich." Still, Hugh took advantage of the situation and let the October issue of Playboy run with Dorothy's naked body on the cover. He even worked her old photos into another issue in December that called her one of the sex stars of the 1980s. A bit questionable to use a dead woman for financial gain. While Dorothy was buried in the same cemetery in Los Angeles as Marilyn Monroe, Paul's remains were sent back to Vancouver, British Columbia, as the Village Voice reported in 1980. As for Paul Snider, his body was returned to Canada in permanent exile from Hollywood. It was all too big for him. In that Elysium of dreams and deals, he'd reached the limit of his class. His sin, his unforgivable sin, was being small time. That's 10-Minute Murder for today. Brief and bingeable true crime. And I hate to take issue with the Village Voice from back in 1980. That's probably chuggy of me. But I would say his most unforgivable sin was murder. I'm not an expert on the hierarchy of sin, but I would think that being small time, it ranks a little bit lower than actually taking someone's life. Hope you enjoyed the episode today. And like I said at the beginning, if you are not currently a subscriber of 10-Minute Murder, I hope you do become one. Just hit subscribe wherever you're listening right now, and you won't miss any future episodes. Also, if you've got friends, congratulations. If you think that they might be into a brief true crime story like the one you heard today, let them know about 10-Minute Murder. However, be sure that it's a friend that you think would like murder stories. It's too close to Christmas to be alienating people, so be gentle in your approach. Thanks for listening to 10-Minute Murder. Be safe and have a good night.